Good afternoon or good morning everybody. Welcome to today's webinar, which is titled 4 Challenging Edits, or maybe 3 or maybe 5. Let's see how far we get. So welcome to those of you who are inside the webinar room, and hello to those of you who are also on Facebook and YouTube as well. So greetings to wherever you may be. Yes, Kubale, you can always watch a recording, don't worry. So we record everything and this is going straight to YouTube, so you can just pick it up afterwards. Before we get to Capture on Goodness, just a couple of housekeeping things. So we've got a max of 60 minutes today. Should be fine for what we need to do. For those of you who are inside the webinar room, if you want to ask a question, it's easier if you pop it into the Q&A tab, because then I can kind of separate it out from the general chat room. So if you've got a question, put it in there. You might find that a nice guy called Andre answers it too. My colleague, he's also marked as admin in this room with a little star, and he'll also help out us answering questions as well. Of course, if you want to chat, do so and just be nice to each other, which I'm sure you will. If you want to hide chat and Q&A, you can do so in the webinar room just by hitting that little button. Those of you who are on Facebook and YouTube, just pop your comments under the video where it's playing, and I'll be able to see those as well. We try to answer as much as possible. Please don't be offended if we don't get to your particular question. All right, so let's see what we're dealing with. Thank you for all your submissions. Now, this isn't necessarily the definitive list. This is just some that I picked out earlier, and we went through a few this morning, and I've just kind of changed it slightly for this afternoon as well. Now, I also did a multitude of OS updates yesterday and other stuff, which is probably reckless and also stupid. So fingers crossed, everyone, that OS behaves itself streaming to all these different places. All right, so Tim Chappell, who I think I saw in the webinar room, he sent in a couple of nice shots. So hi, Tim. What Tim writes in his description. So this is Horseshoe Bend, if you don't recognize it. He found it difficult to select a portion of the sky and perform any meaningful edits that improved the overexposed area. Well, I think you're being a bit hard on yourself, Tim, first of all. Because first of all, it's a very nice shot, and secondly, you've got fairly challenging light going on, because you've got almost blinding yourself with the sun just peeping over the top, and everything else is going to be in some kind of shadow. So the fact that you've got that straight out of camera is also pretty good as well. But this is a really good example for working with luminosity masks, because we've got such that deep separation from the sky to Horseshoe Bend itself. Then it's actually pretty simple to separate those two out. So I think what we're going to do is that. So we're going to leave all the corrections as they are right now, because Tim, your exposure is pretty spot on. The only thing I might do is just hit auto levels just to bring the shadows in a tiny bit, so they're a bit gutsier. But other than that, let's split this photo into two and see what we can do. So the first thing we're going to do is add a new field adjustment layer. So if I press M on my keyboard, you'll be able to see that. So that's just filling the whole shot with a mask. Now with the luminosity range, what are we going to do? We're going to do the sky. Let's do the sky as a separate thing. So with the luminosity range, that puts a constraint on the mask that we've just put on. Now when I'm playing with luminosity ranges, I personally like to view them, sorry, just changing something on my panel. I personally like to view them with the grayscale mask on. It's just a lot easier to see what's going on. So if we turn on our display grayscale mask over here, then boom, the shot goes to white, because white is shown as fully masked. Now when we start to play with our luma range, you'll start to see it all magically creep in. So if I click on the luma range button, this brings up our luma range panel like so. So we want to keep the sky, so we want to make sure we've got all the highlights, and we're gradually going to squeeze this up, and then Horseshoe Bend is going to disappear down to black until we get to a reasonable point, and I'll do it slowly just so you can see the change. So I'm going to stop kind of around, let's see, probably something, we can almost get rid of that little sparkly bit in the front as well. So let's go back a bit, something like that. So that looks kind of good for me. So that's isolated just our sky. Now, when you create a luma range, the separation, if you like, between the masked and non-masked area, so I'm talking about this bit over here, we can see the little sun rays there. The quality of that mask, or how fine that mask is relatively crunchy or binary or whatever. So what we can do is use these two sliders underneath, radius and sensitivity. Now, by default, radius is set to 0. So sensitivity, even though it's set to 50, doesn't have any effect. So even if I push this up to 100, nothing's going to happen. So we have to activate sensitivity by bringing up the radius a bit. So I'm going to pull the radius just over halfway point, and then you see how the quality, no, it's hard to see if you're watching on a small screen. You see the quality of the mask, it's just bled there a little bit. We can zoom in afterwards. And the sensitivity slider really changes how the mask finds that edge. Now, if I go all the way to the left, so let's do that, you see the edge of the mask feathers. Now, in this particular case, that's probably not going to give us the desired result, because when we start changing the sky and the foreground kind of separately, we almost want them to mesh together perfectly. Now, if we push sensitivity in completely the other direction, that will actually do a really nice wrap around all those edges. So I'm going to push sensitivity all the way up to 100 and say apply. And then we're going to press M on our keyboard. And then you can see where we've just got our mask at the top, like so. Now we've called this one sky, so that's good. And what was Tim's issue? Tim, what was your issue? Oh, it was getting some meaningful exposure in the sky. Now you've got yourself a very tough challenge here, because the sun is blasting at you, burning your eyeballs out and everything. So it's not like you're going to get tons of detail or whatever back in the sky. But I wasn't standing next to the rock with you when you took it. Wish I was. I haven't been to Horseshoe Bend as yet. But you're not going to see a perfect blue sky, warm sky or whatever, because you're facing the sun. So you are going to expect it to be relatively bright. So I would pull my highlights down a bit just to get some kind of warmth back in there. But to be honest, Tim, that's probably where I would stop. If we bring the exposure down, we've lost, you know, we don't have any actual detail in the file to do anything with. So I would just pull my highlights down a little bit, maybe the whites a touch, just so we've got some of that warm kind of reddy tone sneaking in. You know, we can see a little bit color variation there, but I would stop at that point. And I honestly wouldn't expect the camera to do any more than that, of course, unless you started bracketing exposures. But I think to me that looks as well perfectly realistic, which is great. Now let's just zoom into our land at the top. Now if we brought our luma range back up, what happens if we brought sensitivity down this way? Then it actually looks slightly different because it's got that feather at the top. But I personally think I would go for the sensitivity always at 100. But the nice thing is about the luma range, you can always retrospectively change it as well. Next thing that we want to do is that we've created our sky luma mask, if you like. So the obvious thing to do, well, rather than try and make one for the foreground, let's just flip this guy around. Now, interesting thing with the luminosity mask, if I make a new layer, so we're going to make a new layer and we call that Horseshoe Bend or foreground, whatever you want to call it. Now, if I copy my sky layer on the top, it's going to be exactly the same. But if I invert it, what does invert do on a layer? It inverts the mask. Now remember, I started with a filled mask. So when you invert a filled mask, it just goes to empty. So then we've actually got no use whatsoever. So as I'm happy with my sky luma mask, I'm going to right click and say rasterize. Now that's basically going to lock it in place. That little sun symbol that was there disappears. So now I've got a mask as if I was super controlled with my hands and just drew it manually like so. So now on my Horseshoe Bend, we're going to right click and say copy mask from the sky. and then we're going to right click and we're going to invert it. So now I've got horseshoe bend, like so. And those two masks, as they are an inverse, they're going to mesh together really nicely, so we won't get any weird haloing or any of that stuff. So what can we do with Tim's horseshoe bend? Well, again, he's got exposure pretty good. It's a little bit muddy and a little bit flat. Do I want to brighten it? I might want to lift the brightness just a touch. Not to sacrifice any of the lovely contrast, I'm going to bring that up a bit, and I'd also add in a little bit, but not too much clarity, because then it starts to look weird around the bottom and the edge of this rock here. So it doesn't actually need that much. Now, as we're shooting into the sun, and this is kind of in a shadow, we're losing some of the nice color tone. So in a very rare move for me, because I normally like to see everything fairly low saturated, I'm going to bring the saturation up as well, just a touch too. Not heavily, just something like that. I might also bring up the white balance a tiny bit as well, because the camera's tried to correct it because it's got loads of sunlight blasting into it, and it's just made it a little bit too cool as well. And last but not least, let's bring rotation, do my weird sitting back in the chair thing. I'm just going to rotate it 0.2 of a degree. Probably hardly worth noticing, but there we go. Now, if I want to hit Y on my keyboard for before and after, then we can see before and after like so. So Tim, if you were watching, I wouldn't go any further than that on the sky, A, because there isn't any sensor data to do that, and then I don't think it would look especially realistic. I think you've taken a cracking shot, and just a few tweaks, it can work out quite nicely. Okay, any questions going on? So you're quiet in the chat room, I can see. Let's look in the Q&A tab. Oh wow, lots of questions coming in. Okay, are my lips out of sync? I don't know, hopefully not. If they are, I do apologize. What was the purpose of that luma layer, Jerome was saying? What did I try to achieve? I tried to achieve just separating out the brighter part of the sky so it can be independently edited from the foreground. So sorry for not explaining that well enough. But because we had the luma range on the sky, it's easy to copy and just make a inverse of that for the foreground. It's a really handy technique if you do have those extremes of exposure. Can the luma range be used with other tools in the same layer? Remember, the luma range is just creating your mask. Then you can use any other tools as you wish. Does rasterizing the image foreground mean this part of the image is no longer raw? No, it's just related to the mask. So when we make a luminosity mask, it has a little sunshine next to it, which means I can always go back into the luma range and tweak it further. Let's just add a luma range one there. So you see it's got a little sunshine next to it. So that means at any point I can go back into the luma range tool and play around with it, or I can completely remove it. But what I wanted to do was copy and invert it. So I wanted to copy that actual mask of the sky, not the luma range information or any of that stuff, just the mask that I made in the sky. So by rasterizing it, it means fix the mask as it is. I lose or I forfeit the ability to go back in and play with the luma range, but it does mean, one, I could copy it, and two, we could then invert it. So we had our horseshoe bend at the front. So I hope that makes sense. Mark says, why not bring up the shadows? Because I don't want to, Mark. Let's see. We could a bit, but also remember, realistically, if you, Tim, and myself, Mark, were standing on top of this rock, this is going to be in shadow to some extent. So if we bring up the shadows by a lot, that just looks terrible because it doesn't look realistic. What I might be tempted to do is bring up the shadows a bit, but pull the blacks down, and then it gives us some shadow contrast, which actually looks quite nice. So I wouldn't open that up, but I would do that. Rick, hey Rick, in Hawaii, I guess. Can you drop in a new sky? No, you can't in Capture One. So Capture One is not, whilst we cross over a lot into what you can do in Photoshop, I would say a good way to categorize it is that you cannot do image composition. So you can't bring, whoops, nearly dropped my pen, can't bring in two different things together, or two different images together, sorry. Okay, Anoop says, can we download the raw file? If Tim would let us to, I'm sure, but these are photos from customers that have been sent in. So obviously we're not going to share them because you didn't give us permission to. So sorry to disappoint you there. Let's see, Anoop again. Oh, hi Anoop. When we increase the radius of luma range, which radius are we actually talking about in the pic? So that's, if you think of the mask and you've applied your luma range to it, when you increase the radius, that's which kind of range is the sensitivity going to affect? So if radius is very small, then the sensitivity slide is only going to affect like a small bunch of pixels around edges. If you make sensitivity much larger, then we're going to affect more pixels around the edge. Now in this situation, sensitivity or radius doesn't need to be that high because we've kind of got a straight edge. But if I was trying to blend around the curve of something or some feathers or something like that, then you could play around with the radius a bit as well. Cool. Oh, and Erling said, why not lift the shadows a bit as well? There we go, we did it. But say I wouldn't do it too much because it just looks a bit false to me. Cool, all right. What is next? So thanks for your shot, Tim. We did your other one this morning as well, which was also a nice shot too. Where shall we go next? Let's go to Hank. What did Hank say? This is actually a nice simple edit, Hank. And again, it's kind of a bit related to, just trying to find Hank's notes, a bit related to really what's in the sensor. I'm going to squint at the tiny print on the screen. I have problems with this photo to find the best colors. The photo was taken early in the morning, but I cannot capture the right morning lighting exposure. I actually think, again, you've done a pretty good job, Hank. You guys are really tough on yourselves, I'll tell you. So I'm just going to straighten the horizon a touch. And again, if we look at the sun, which is just sitting behind the farmhouse here, good little thing to see or know, you know, is there anything left, or is there any data at all that I can possibly recover? How much energy should I expend into seeing if there's anything here? So if I bring your exposure all the way down, we do have some, but it is starting to bloom a bit, you know, on the sensor. So if we recover it by that much, is it going to look kind of awkward or unrealistic? So I would possibly bring down the overall exposure a bit at the expense of losing some in the foreground. And then how much can we recover with the shadows? I think this was a Fuji camera. What have we got? An XT2, it's a good little camera. So if we open up the shadows, how much can we get? There's actually quite a bit of dynamic range in there, which is interesting. If we pull up the blacks, what do we get there? Quite a different look. Kind of commit that to memory what raising the blacks does. Commit that to memory what raising the shadows does. So the blacks is just pulling up the very darkest tones, which is why it looks maybe somewhat unrealistic, whereas the shadows is bringing up a lot more of the general, I guess if we look at the histogram from here to here. If you look at that peak of the histogram and how it wiggles, for a technical word, so you see it's affecting a bit of the midtones and the shadows. If we pull the blacks, you see how that midtone bump here kind of stays static. So it's only affecting the bottom end. So for Hank's picture, I would open the shadows a bit and open the blacks just a tiny bit. Because it is very early morning, I'm going to expect this to be relatively dark anyway. If I go any further than that, then I lose maybe some realism. If we open the shadows more and we go in this direction, does that look better? I almost want to open up this area a bit separately, to be honest, because I don't want to go any more here because the field to me looks about right, but this area is a bit dark in the front. So let's make a new field adjustment layer, and I'm totally winging it here because I didn't practice on Hank's shot. It came in later today, so I only just kind of picked it out before we started. So now I'm just looking at this area. So if I want to lift up the foreground a bit more, that's a bit more shadow and a bit more black. And we're working off a field mask here because I want to see what the sliders can do just at this spot. So right now this mask is filled, but we're going to clear it in a second. So I think possibly that's as much as I would want to open up this fence, but it's too much for the rest of the shot. It now doesn't look like early morning anymore. And if I right click and say clear mask, that's going to get rid of the mask, but it's going to keep my shadow and black. So now if I grab my brush and I'm going to right click, make this nice and big, and then my flow is set super low. So that means when I start brushing, it's not going to give me the whole adjustment in one go. It's going to let me brush back and forth and build it up nice and slowly. So if I just do a little bit of brushing in the foreground here, we can just open up this fence panel a bit, and then maybe just a little bit kind of over there as well, just to get a bit more into that. Now if I turn the foreground off and back on, it's just lifted that up just a tiny bit. Doesn't need much because again we want it to look nice and natural. Now in regards to, let's just go back to the background with regards to the sky. So we've got exposure down overall and we've got highlights. Could bring those down a bit more, and then let's just make sure it's not getting too flat and add a bit of overall clarity in as well. But for me, I actually don't mind the bright sunburst behind there because that's almost what I would expect. If it bothers you, again, I would handle that locally, much like we did with the shadows. Because otherwise, if you try and fix that in kind of one hit, like if we really bring the whites down, to me, it just doesn't look realistic. I personally don't mind the fact that it's blowing out. Okay, let's have a look at some questions. Let's see. Chris says rasterizing is a big help. Yes, definitely is. Oh, we were going back to the last one. Sorry. Photo looks very Dutch, Jerome says. Definitely does. Very flat. Let's have a look. Okay, we've answered some of those questions. And there we go. Okay, let's go over to YouTube and Facebook. Let's have a look. Melissa says, hey Melissa, thanks for keeping things real. A fake and over processed photo really turns me off. And it does for me too, because don't forget, a digital camera will in some ways see a lot more than your eyes can. Doesn't mean that you should then show that or show off the dynamic range capabilities of your camera, because if it doesn't look realistic, it actually doesn't psychologically gel with you quite nicely. Let's look at the before and after on Hanks. So that's how it came out of camera. Very hard to expose that well. I think you did that just about right. And then just opening up the shadows a little bit, but not too much. Now, if you think you've gone too far, like I think I might have actually gone too far with the foreground, I might even bring that back down a tiny bit as well, just to keep it nice and real, as Melissa says. All right, I saw a question here, says, hi Matt, I'm David by the way, but hi Rajesh, can you bring up the Astro shot next? Yeah, I think I will have a look at the Astro shot because that is quite an interesting one to do for sure. So shall we do it now or shall we do something else? As we've done a couple of landscapes, let's flick over to a non-landscape. Now I edited this shot this morning, was quite an interesting one. From, who was this from? This was from Bernard, I think, possibly. Let me just check who this was from. Let's just bring this up. I don't want to say it's the wrong person. This is from Bernard. Yeah. So, great shot. I think very difficult. Whoops. Let's try and bring the photo up. Great shot. I think very difficult to edit this kind of thing. You've got no control over the lighting. Color temperature of lights is all over the place. You're often shooting into the light and the lights are often moving and all that stuff. So it's really difficult. So a couple of issues that Bernard had issues with. Let's just make a clone that variant. Sorry, I'm just going to reset that. So that's how it came out of the camera and that's how Bernard edited it. And I think did a pretty good job. of course, there's all kinds of directions you can go with this. And what Bernard's issue was, let's go to 200%. He was worried about the noise creeping into the background. It's more prevalent here where it goes into a slightly darker tone. So he wanted some advice on that. And also there was this troublesome light, if we look on the original, this troublesome light in the background, which is in a totally different color range to everything else. And this was quite a fun edit this morning because we had lots of people saying, why don't you try this? Why don't you try that? So there was about 10 different ways we could deal with this annoying light in the background. So let's get to it. So I'll point out a couple of errors which I think Bernard made, which is no criticism. That's just how it goes. So I'm just going to crop it a little bit. And as it is out of camera, it's really not a bad shot. I think the edit I did earlier was that one. So it was quite different from Bernard's. I tried to focus on her a little bit as the artist. Where's the one that we're doing now? I'm going to get confused. And just make it a little bit more moody and atmospheric. Now, Bern said he took the white balance off the ring on her finger. Now, when I went to white balance it, I was like, where do you start? Because you don't really have any reference. I don't know what colour clothing she's wearing. There's nothing of grey kind of in the scene or whatever. If we hit auto, what does Capture One make of it? Capture One thinks it's more along those lines. Does that then ruin the atmosphere? I'm willing to think that's probably closer to how it was. Let's reset that. But does it then make it a bit dull and boring? I don't know. The other thing which I was conscious of on Bernard's edit was that on the guitar, if we look at the blue channel, it's totally at 0. So it's full black, which if I was going to print this, stick it online, I've got risk of a bit of posterization going on down here and everything as well. So that's something I would like to try and avoid too. So if we've got the nice atmosphere going on here, then do I want to do that? I don't know. I could also throw a bit of color in later on, but if we do go in that direction, we do get more of this light popping up, which is kind of what we don't want. But I'm going to settle for something like that. Next, I would throw in a bit of contrast, but not too much, because again, we don't want to risk losing any data in the guitar itself. I would add some clarity because it's a nice way to add a bit of punch to that. And I would also pop in a bit of vignetting as well, just to focus in on her a little bit as well. Now, by doing that, again, I'm very conscious of the guitar. I don't want her face to go into too much shadow. So giving the face a little lift could be something to do, and then we deal with this pesky light in the background. So first of all, I'm going to make a new field adjustment layer. And again, if I press M on the keyboard, it's filling everything, but the point of filling it first is so we can dial in the kind of adjustment that we want. So if I zoom in on her face a little bit, and then we just open up what's going to have the best effect. Open up the shadows potentially a bit, just so we've got some more light going on there. So that's probably good, but it's too much shadow lift for everything else. So I'm going to just call this one face. Right click and clear the mask. So we're back to the nice atmosphere. Grab my brush, right click, we're going to make it a bit smaller so it kind of fits in this spot. The flow is nice and low again. So then if we just brush back and forth, just kind of over the right hand side, it's just going to raise the shadows there a little bit as well. Now if I wanted to, I could just lift a little bit down there too. And if we turn face on and off, so that's before and then after. So it's not much, it's like a third of a stop or something like that. But just to make sure she doesn't disappear into nothing. Now if we want to do more, we can just do a few more brush strokes. And again, if you think you've done too much, we could bring the opacity down to 0, back up to 100 to kind of blend in exactly where you want it. Alrighty. Okay, so what else are we going to do with this? Now, the other thing that Bernard was struggling with was sharpening as well. So if we look at Bernard's edit, so he's actually dialed in a bit of clarity and structure 14 and 16. Now, clarity is our contrast adjustment that only affects the midtones. Structure is something that's going to help edge definition. Now, as this was shot at 400 ISO or 4000 ISO, just looking at camera data, 4000 ISO, relatively high ISO on a D750. So we've got a little bit of noise creeping in. So what I would strongly suggest not to do is add any structure whatsoever, because structure, if we just pull if we go back to the background, let's reset structure. Oh, hang on a minute. That's strange. Why is it resetting to 16? Oh, I must have inadvertently saved a default for this camera. So let's put this back to 0. That was probably this morning. Someone else spotted that as well. Save as defaults for D750. Okay, so I want to make sure I don't get that popping back in. Okay, I am going to, let's see, where are we? I'll just make sure I haven't been editing the wrong shot after all this. That would be embarrassing, wouldn't it? Oops, now I'm in the levels tool. Ah, it's all gone wrong. Right, let's try again. Now I think I was editing the right shot. Yeah, face, that's good. Bring those down. So I must have done a partial reset along the line. So let's just reset a few other things. So it's all going a bit strange. Sorry about that. Probably because I copied the variant. Should I start again, or where are we? I just want to make sure there's no other... Oh, there's all kinds of stuff going on. All right, okay. Let's do a speed edit. We're going to make a new variant. Or we clone it. Let's do hard reset. That's funny, it has. That's a good spot, whoever spotted that. I saw that before. That was Andreas. Why hasn't it fully reset? That is a really good question. I don't know. So I'm going to say, in this case, let's do a new variant. That's better. Let's go to Bernard's folder. There's just something a bit weird going on with my variants there for some reason. But let's check. Now we're back at 0. Okay, that looks kind of flat. I was wondering why it was looking a bit noisier than I thought this morning. Okay, so super speed edit. We're going to drop the white balance down a bit. We're going to add some contrast. We're going to fire in an auto levels, but not too much because we don't want the guitar to go black. We're going to add a bit of clarity. We are going to check on our guitar to make sure it's fine. It is. And then we're going to not add structure. And I'm going to add a bit of vignetting. And what we're going to do is do the face quickly. So that's a new field adjustment layer. This is how fast you would normally edit it. Open up the shadows a little bit, like so. And then right click, clear mask, grab a brush. Make sure we've got low flow. And then just open up her face a little bit as well. Turn off this layer. There we go. So we're now back to somewhere that I spotted. So well done. That was Andreas who spotted that. So good spot. All right. Let's put in a bit more vignetting. And then now we can talk about Burns' issue, which was adding structure, which makes this noise pop out. So if we go back to the one that I have just been editing, you see noise-wise, it looks actually relatively clean. That's pretty good for 4000 ISO. So, but the problem is, if we start to dial in some structure, let's just put in a bit, instantly that noise structure becomes, or that noise becomes more apparent. So I would not add structure to this shot. Also because her face, as she's kicked back, rocking out, it's just disappearing out of focus. So by adding structure, it's not going to help at all. The guitar is nice and pin sharp, as we can see. So what I might be more tempted to do is with our sharpening, we could add a bit more sharpening if you're worried about that it was getting soft, and add a bit of halo suppression because that will stop any nastiness going on with the grain. So by adding a bit of sharpening, we've still got a nice tack sharp guitar, but we haven't accentuated any of the structure. So I would well and truly avoid doing that. Now, just looking at the shot again, I think I would, if we go back to our main adjustments, I would probably add in a bit more contrast than that, and to avoid the blacks getting too dark, just open them a touch too. Kenneth says that's awesome for 4000 ISO because the D750 has a brilliant sensor. Yeah, it does. I mean, you can't argue with that. If we look at the viewer labels for a second, So we're at 1/320th of a second, so we're not actually gathering that much light either at ISO 4000. That's actually pretty good. Okay, so the last thing that I want to deal with is the pesky light in the top. Now, when I was playing with this yesterday, I tried healing it, didn't work, looked terrible. I tried like healing from these two bits to up there, kind of didn't work. Tried grabbing this strut and putting that over there. That didn't work either, looked a bit of a mess. By far the best thing I've found to try and not remove it, but just reduce it a bit, because it is really way out of the color range of everything else, was just to try and knock this back a little bit. So I made a new layer, and we're going to call this color light, whatever you want to call it. Going to grab a brush, and then we're going to mask it with full flow. So we're going to grab M and just kind of draw a mask around it. Going to make this a bit larger, and it's fully soft. So just kind of a pretty fluffy mask like that, not especially accurate. M to hide the mask again. Go to our advanced color editor, grab the picker, and then let's zoom in a bit, because it's actually surprising this. So if I pick kind of, let's go for that, then we get our suggested color range. And if we start to, let's just pull the saturation down a second. So you can see it's got rid of that bit, but not the stuff around the outside. So if I pull this around, that will start to spread to the rest of it like that. Now, we had all kinds of discussion, disagreements this morning about what to do next. So yes, we could pull the saturation out a bit, ever so slightly. Just kind of takes the edge off it, that's one thing. We could pull the hue to try and shift it in that direction and maybe take the saturation down, or we could go the hue in this direction, looks kind of worse. So I'm kind of dealing with it with something like that. So just a hue shift slightly and to take the saturation down. Someone else also had the bright idea of using the skin tone tool to try and normalize the colors into that area. And it almost worked. I think probably if I spent a bit more time masking, that could also be a nice effect. But now if we look at color light, so that's before and after, maybe if I pull the opacity down, then we can get, it's got a little hint there, but it's not quite as garish as it was before. So I think that ended up as quite a nice fix as well. The only other thing, maybe the front is getting a bit too dark. I don't know about that. Maybe that's the vignette is a bit too strong. Nah, it's probably all right. We still got detail there. I just don't want that to go down to 0. So if we hit on before, so again, pretty good out the camera. I think you guys, as I said, you're always hard on your editing, but it's just to kind of bump up the contrast a bit, get rid of that pesky light in the background. And just be careful about the sharpening. Don't use structure. Andreas says, how about color balance? Oh yeah, that's an idea. We could probably play around with the color balance tool as well. See, another idea that someone came up with. What would we do? We'd want to go to the opposite, and is it a mid-tone? So would we go in that direction? Maybe. So again, I think the problem is with using color balance, it's going to affect the whole mask. The benefit of clicking and with the advanced color editor, then we can decide exactly what range it should affect. So it's kind of one-upping the color balance tool in that respect, because we can pick within it. But good choice, Andreas. See, that's another suggestion that we didn't have this morning as well. Let's see for questions. Lots were coming in. So what's John saying? Hi, John. Nice to see you. Thanks for teaching me a new perspective. We met at WPPI. We did. And I had no idea we'd be learning for you. So thanks for joining, John. It's a pleasure to meet as well. Okay, I'm just going to pull out a couple of questions. That one seems to be quite controversial. What does Q&A say? Does adding clarity affect the noise? That's a good question, Bob. Not in the same way that structure does, because it's a mid-tone contrast. So if we went completely bananas on the noise, sorry, on the clarity, then we actually get an improvement in that mid-tone contrast, but it wouldn't actually exacerbate the noise much more. What I might do, and what I forgot, I would probably just bump up luminance noise reduction a bit, like so. But if we put this online, if we printed this, that noise, no one's going to see it at all. But if we were a bit heavy-handed with sharpening or structure, then there's more of a chance it could creep in. Are sharpening defaults particular to the sensor? Yes, they are. So depending on the sensor and ISO, that's going to influence, well, ISO is going to influence what's going on with noise reduction. The camera is going to influence what's going on with sharpening. So the values you see for sharpening will vary based on the camera. So some can take a bit more, some can take a bit less. Noise reduction is always 50-50-50. But again, depending on the ISO on the camera, there's a bit more going on under the hood to kind of give you the cleanest start point possible without the expense of removing detail. So we're never going to get to a point like on this shot. We're not going to deliver you a shot with no noise, because that's going to remove some detail, because there's nothing wrong with a little bit of noise going in. It's not offensive, it doesn't ruin the shot or anything like that. So it actually works out quite nicely. But yes, Charles, they are unique to the camera, which is good. Susan said, why did I open up the shadows on the mask and then clear it? That was just, let's just write face. So that was just to open up the face a bit, like so. So the point of starting with the field mask and playing around with the sliders is that you get to see what they're going to do, and then you can brush it in after you've cleared it to a lesser amount, or let it build up. We'll probably do that again, Susan, as well, so don't worry too much. Nice recovery, David, Paul says. Thanks for that. Is there anything wrong with masking the more noisy areas and using negative structure to help smooth it out? There isn't really. Like, if you wanted to spend time masking the background, then you could, but I don't think you'd actually get much usable benefit at the end of it, to be honest. Like, as I said, if you printed it, looked at it online, remember we're looking at 100% and we're going like this to see it. So if you imagine this on a web page, do you know that's noisy there? No, not at all. Actually, it's not an offensive noise structure either. Actually, it looks quite nice. The other thing you could do if you wanted, you could throw a bit of film grain in there. So if we did some bit of silver rich grain or something, you could add grain to it too, and then that way that kind of is another option as well. So last few questions and then we move on to the next one. Lots of comments. What's the difference between adding sharpening and structure to the image? So with sharpening is a bit more of a finer instrument. Structure is very kind of a blunt instrument. It's just literally more or less. There's no radius choice or anything like that. Structure will work better the sharper or the more detailed the start point is. So if you have a super sharp image with loads of detail, you can push structure a bit further. A noisier image like this, leave it alone. Sharpening just gives you a few more nuances to help adjust that. So like for this one, for example, we had halo suppression. So that means when you push sharpening a bit harder, you can just get rid of any nasty halos caused by that, which is something you couldn't do with structure, for example. Okay, all right. Okay, everyone, let's move on. Johnny says, don't you think the two lights in the middle are bright, distracting for the subject? Maybe, but there's zero detail in there, so you could try and heal them maybe to get rid of them, but I actually don't mind it personally. But you could try healing. There's no way to drop the exposure on those because it's totally burnt out. Look at the RGB values 255, so we can't pull any sliders to get anything back. Alrighty, let's go on to another one. It seems like that shot we could edit for ages and ages. Right, how much time we got? 15 minutes. Let's go to, that one's relatively similar to Horseshoe with a Luma mask, so we don't need to do that. Oh, we wanted to see Astro, didn't we? So let's actually see if this shot resets. I don't know why that one was being a pest and not resetting, but everything is on 0 here. So this was by, let's just see who sent this in. Just need to check the notes. So this is from JC. JC, if you're watching, hello. Let's see what JC said. Again, I think JC was a bit hard on himself here. JC wrote a lot, but basically how to keep the sky right with a good tone in balance with the foreground, bringing out the stars and colouring in the Milky Way. Town lights to the left, these down here, what to do with those. I actually didn't do anything with them, spoiler alert. And again, that whole question of noise and so on. And what should I do with this cloud in the top left? To which I said, leave it where it is, because I think it looks pretty cool. So again, we can do a similar thing with luminosity masking here as well. So let's just close that window. So we're going to start with a field adjustment layer. Sorry, didn't fill it. If you do that and forget to add a field one, we can just say fill mask. So if we press M on my keyboard, you can see what's going on. So we're not going to get perfect separation of a perfect cutout cactus in the sky, but it's actually good enough for what we need to do. So let's look at our grayscale mask again. Turn on luma range, and what are we going to try and get out? We are going to get the cactus, I think. So that's kind of in the darker tones. So if we go like that, and let's see what we can liberate. So we can almost get it like so. Now I'm not worried about the splats in the top because we can actually erase that. So if I say apply and press M on my keyboard, that gives us really a fairly acceptable mask of cactus and foreground. If we look at the grayscale mask once again, display grayscale mask, we've got some kind of mess in the top, but remember we're applying a luminosity constraint to a mask, and the mask was a filled mask. So if I grab my eraser and simply say don't bother about this bit, like so, then we actually end up with a pretty good mask. Now in terms of what do we want to do for our sensitivity and that kind of stuff, I would bring up the radius and the sensitivity a bit, just so it's kind of wrapping a bit nicer around all those various different edges, like so. Now again, it's not perfect, but for the task that we're going to do, I think it will work quite nicely. All right, next thing to do before I forget is to call this cactus so I know what the heck it is. And I think I'm pretty happy with how that mask looks, to be honest. So I'm going to take a gamble and rasterize it right now, and we're going to make a new layer, and we're going to call that sky, and we're going to copy the mask from cactus with a right click, and we're going to right click again and invert it so we've got our Milky Way in the background like so, and a bit of cactus, but it doesn't really matter so much. By the way, I should add, I've never shot Astro in my life, so if when I edit this it looks terrible, that's because I have no experience of editing Astro. So I'm just going on my knowledge of just editing in general. Now with our sky mask, let's just check that. That should just be the sky. If we pull up the contrast, we actually start to see a bit more Milky Way going on, like so. So surprisingly, we can pull that pretty much before we're not going to lose any shadows or anything like that. Now the only thing I might be mindful of, if we go for clarity too much, we're going to end up with a halo around our cactus. So we're going to be a little bit careful not to overdo it with that. I'll also bring, I was going to say exposure, maybe brightness down a bit, so we can see a bit more of the fluffiness going on. And can we kind of bring that out a bit more at the expense of, just trying to think, if we pull the blacks down a bit, that gives us a bit more super dark sky at the top. Now I don't know if the brightness behind it bothers you, but I think that's probably, I think we can get away with it, because if we look at the Milky Way, it's kind of behind the cactus as well. So I don't mind just pulling that down a bit, because then it darkens our sky at the top. It's a little bit blue. Astro people, let me know if that's all right, or if it should be black. But otherwise, I think that looks quite nice. So if we turn the sky on and off, you can see what it's doing. Now it is affecting our cactus a bit, but we're going to correct that with our cactus layer, remember. So let's open up the brightness a little bit of our cactus. Could maybe even bump up. Going to be really careful. Don't want to kind of mess it up too much. Let's just turn the mask off. That helps. Actually, this mask could have been better, I feel, for the cactus. When I did it this morning, we had a bit more cactus going on, so I need to be a bit careful with that. So if I do Option M and look at our mask, what I might do, just so we don't get any weird stuff going on, is just manually open up that mask a little bit more. So that's a bit of a mess up in my respect. So I'm going to keep the flow low and just open up there a little bit, and just up on the vein slightly and around there, just so it's not too much weirdness going on when we start to try and play with this. So what we're going to do, cactus, so we need to open up the shadows a bit on the cactus, and then I think if we drop the blacks, we get a bit more shadow contrast going on, and open up the brightness a little touch as well. Now if we turn the sky off, yeah, the sky is actually messing with our cactus too much. When I did it this morning, it actually looked much better. So let's turn contrast down a bit, like so. So this is one of those situations, if I was doing it myself, I would edit it again. Because I think when I rasterized my Luma mask, I was a little bit overly keen. I don't think I kept the edit from this morning. That's a shame. So what I would do, I would have refined that a little bit more. So whose shot was this? This was JC's shot. So JC, watch the recording from this morning, and then you'll see a slightly better job. But all I did with the cactus at the front really is just open up the brightness a little bit, and then drop the blacks, and that gave us a little bit more contrast and throw in a bit more clarity as well. But the mask isn't quite doing it justice. I like your comment, Rob. Paul Reifer is good with this pics. Yes, Paul Reifer is definitely better at editing these pics than I am. But I think with a bit more care, you could pull this cactus away from the sky, and then it actually works quite nicely, as it did this morning. So it's a pity I didn't keep my edit from that. Can you copy the mask from the one you did this morning to this one? No, Chili was saying, because I didn't keep it, but a smart person would have kept that. But otherwise it would work quite nicely. What we could do, let's go to our sky a second. Let's try again. Let's say fill mask, like so. So we've got a mask over the whole shot. Hang on. Oh, it won't. Let's clear mask, and then let's say fill mask. There we go. So we can see what's going on. Let's add our Luma range, and let's kind of play with it in real time. So we want the blacks. So let's pull these down. See if this doesn't completely kill the machine. So that's going too far. Personally, I find it easier looking at the mask. So let's see. Oh, we want to go in the other direction. Get it right, David. This is going to be one of those shots that I bow to the great Paul Reifer and let him edit it next week. But there we go. Again, I would say we need to spend a bit more time playing around with the Luma mask, but it worked great this morning. Anyway, we're going to edit a different shot instead. Let's take some questions. Is that a bird in the cactus photo? Don't know. It looks like a bird, but it's actually a cloud. Jess was asking, when you use punch versus natural on clarity, how are they different? That's actually a good question, Jess. Let's just turn the sky off for a second and turn that one off for a second. Let's salvage this by answering Jess's question. Let's pull up clarity. It's actually not bad if we've actually done a better job if we do that. Clarity, okay, let's put structure back down. Natural is kind of your go-to clarity setting, I would say, because you can push it quite hard without it turning nasty. If we go to punch, watch the image change. It's only going to be a subtle amount, but if we go to punch, and it's very subtle on this shot, is that it just adds a little bit more saturation. So 10% saturation. Let's zoom in on the cactus. So if we go to natural, and then we go to punch, see if you look at the lights in the background, it's just a little bit more saturated. But that's really is all there is to it. So if you want to exaggerate those color tones a bit as well, then go for punch. Okay, oh look, we've got all the astro experts coming in now. You can heat the galactic center a little if you want as well. There we go. As I said, I'm no astro expert, but I'll take your word for it, Miguel, definitely. But actually, just kind of the quick edit we've done there looks a bit better than me doing a bad luminosity mask. So there we go. And then let's don't forget the crop. I would go in a bit tighter. So have a play, JC. I think with a bit more care with luma masking, you could pull out the sky and make that sky a little bit darker as well if you wanted to. But right now, that's just a little bit too much. What about if we brought opacity down? Stop it, David. There's nothing you can do with this one. Actually looks best like that. All right, we've got 4 or 5 minutes left. So let's finish on a high, not a low. And then let's play with this shot from Diego. So I'm going to reset this. Let's check it actually resets properly this time. Yes, it does. And really for Diego, it was just a case of like the shot, like the composition. Can we do anything lighting wise to make it a little bit more interesting? Again, it's actually pretty good out of camera. In terms of rotation, I might just kick it left a little bit, like so, by 0.1 of a degree, slightly pedantic. Cropping wise, we're going to pull this down just to make it a bit more panoramic and lose this fountain in the left because that's a bit of a distraction, I feel. And just pull that up slightly. Exposure wise is pretty good. I think it could do with warming up ever so slightly, not by much, and a bit of extra contrast and also some clarity. So maybe I'm gonna not do that. Now in terms of lighting and everything else, blacks down to make the blacks a bit richer, just make sure we're not losing our shadows. What I did with this one was just, we've got loads of light coming at the front here. I thought it was kind of nice maybe to accentuate that a little bit as well. So we're going to use the Alexander Fleming floof technique, as he likes to call it. So we're going to make a new layer and we're going to call that floof or fluff for want of a better description. And on our curve, we're just going to grab the shadow point and pull it up to kind of around here. Grab ourselves a brush. Make this nice and big and soft and with a super low flow, and then essentially we can just gradually brush, and then this will just lighten this area a little bit as well. So again, it's not going to be by much, but it's just going to kind of give us a slightly brighter tone. So if I turn floof off and back on, then it's just opening up in those trees a little bit. Now if it's too much, I can do more in the middle. Don't forget, we can always bring our opacity down to something as well. But that was just to kind of accentuate what was already there in terms of the natural lighting itself. And maybe to focus on our umbrella a bit, let's pull down a bit of a vignette as well. So there we go. So that was a speedy edit, but if we bring on our before and after, so that's as sent by Diego, and then just a few little tweaks like so. So it's kind of a dodge and burn almost, but just brightening out that spot in the middle. So that little handy floof technique, courtesy of our product manager Alex, I think works really nicely just for doing little sunspots or flares here and there. Looks quite natural. Personally think that's the easiest way to do it. All right, let's fly through the last few questions. Let's look in the Q&A tab. Jordan says, it gives me some ideas. Astro is tough. It's tough for me as well, as you can see. Tim says, could we use the eraser on the cactus in the sky mask? Yeah, that might work a little bit as well. Probably should have done that. I'm not going to go back and try and polish the mistake that I did anymore. Jess, we answered your question. Gary says, I see you're using a pen. I use a mouse. Do you feel the pen gives me more accuracy with edits? I started using a pen years ago, actually. Be giving up my age if I told you, but a very long time ago. This is probably the 4th Wacom I'm on now. For me, I find it more comfortable if we grab a mouse up here. I don't find holding a mouse comfortable for long periods of time. And also when you're brushing, it's more like, or with a pen, it's more like actually drawing on paper. So when we were doing our little floof thing, that is more like a drawing action. It's very easy to draw back and forth like this, as opposed to scrubbing away with a mouse. I don't find it a very natural action. I don't use any of the pressure sensitivity stuff on the pen that's possible. I'm not deft enough to do that. But the mere action of holding a pen and making drawing strokes, I find much easier than click drag with a mouse. And if you're doing it for long periods, a mouse I feel is relatively uncomfortable. I only started using this because I got RSI in the top of my hand from those stupid Apple circular mice. If you, again, my age, you might remember those, that Apple had a mouse that was just like a hockey puck, and it was a horrible thing to hold because it would gradually creep round and then you'd have to reorientate it, and then you'd be clawing at it like a madman as well. So I used a pen because of that, but I don't use a mouse for anything now. I use a pen just in daily work, find it much more comfortable. Now, you don't have to spend tons of money. The Wacom entry level one, which is I think they've changed the name recently. Whatever the cheapest Wacom one is more than enough for playing around in Capture One. The one I have has more fancy stuff like shortcut buttons on the left, pressure sensitivity, which I don't use. You will get on perfectly well using a nice cheap Wacom. Okay. Susan says, thanks so much. I found this very helpful and I agree completely on keeping photos natural. Good. Glad to hear it. Byrne says, can I review this webinar later? Yep, it's going straight to YouTube, so you can go back and watch it immediately if you wish, and all the mistakes I made as well. Gary says, this was one of the best seminars I've watched in a while. That's good, Gary. I'm glad it wasn't a complete mess. Let's see. Just looking at the last question. Jill, sounds like Jill. I'm sad my photo got skipped. Sorry, Jill. I assume that was your one here, Jill Sanders. It's actually a lovely shot. And did I try and edit it earlier? Didn't do a huge amount to it, I don't think. Highlights drop down. What else is on the before and after? It's actually pretty nice out of camera. The only thing that I might have done for this one is just maybe try and darken the tops a little bit with the local adjustment. Just on this one, it's getting a little bit too bright. But otherwise, it's a pretty nice shot. And again, I think you're being hard on yourself. Looks good on the camera. Good out the camera. Just going to pick the last few questions. Let's see. Can you all explain this a bit about the masks? Yeah, so if we just grab this shot again. Whoops, I'm going to fill this mask. So we've got a mask over the whole shot. If we put a luma range on it, let's just pick any old luma range and say apply. Something like that. What did we make? So there's our luma range mask that we made. Now I can go back in at any point and play with that luma range. So I can always go back and shift it if I didn't think it was quite right. Now I can erase parts of it, but I can't necessarily add to it. So if we look at our mask, I could grab my erase brush and then I could take a bite out of it, as you can see, like so. But if I brush in it, it's only going to let me brush based on the constraint that I've set in the luma range. So if I start brushing here, notice that it's not letting me brush on the sky because it doesn't match with what I've set in the luma range. But what if I'd set my luma range perfectly and thought, oh, I just want to include this little bit which is out of scope of the luma range? Then I can right click and say rasterize. So now the mask as if I'd drawn it myself, and then I could then add to that mask as well. So it's basically, are you keeping the mask dynamic, allowing it to be controlled by luma range, or are you saying, I'm done, and now I want to be able to take bites out of that mask, erase bits, or add little bits to it. So I hope that makes sense as well. All right, that's probably a good note to end on, I would say. If you want to join in more of the fun and the hilarity next week, on Tuesday, we have another quick live session, carrying on with our theme of light, which is kind of running throughout Instagram and so on and so forth. And we are going to do, says he, not remembering his own schedule. So if I look on YouTube for a second, then I will be able to remind myself what we're doing next week. Next week we are doing luminosity masking. There we go. So just briefly on Tuesday afternoon for half an hour. So if you want to talk a little bit more about rasterizing and so on, we're just going to spend the whole 20-25 minutes looking at different luma masks, when to rasterize, when not to rasterize. So Jill, you can come back and listen to that as well. And then the day after, on Wednesday, not Thursday, I've got a great guest, Felix Kunz. He's going to join me, and we are going to look at some BTS of a shoot he's doing next week, talk about his lighting, how he lights to then maximize the editing potential in Capture One. So a little bit of lighting fun and also a bit of editing fun as well. So there we go. All right, everybody. Thank you for joining. Sorry for doing a crappy job on the Astro shot, but there we go. That's how it goes sometimes. So I hope to see you all again soon, especially next week. And take care. Have a great weekend. Bye now.